Hello, welcome back to another episode of Betty Knits. This is the fourth episode. Last week we did the two fundamental stitches, knit and purl. And so this week we're going to do some of the different textures that you can create with your knitting once you've mastered those two stitches. I'm going to talk about four different types of knitting that you can create with those two stitches. The first one I'm going to talk about is ribbing, is the ribbed effect, and you often see that on garments of clothing. The second one is the moss seed stitch. That's a really nice kind of thick and quite kind of bumpy textured type of knitting. Then there's the double moss seed stitch, which is very much obviously like the moss seed stitch, but is even more pronounced. And then also the woven stitch, which looks almost like a kind of basket that's been woven. It's a really nice effect. So those are the four that we're going to go through in this video, and there are many more that you can do with knit and purl stitches, and we will talk about some more of those a bit further down the line. And I'd also love it if anyone had any that were their particular favourites that they do with those two stitches. I've seen on Pinterest there's something called the waffle stitch, which looks a bit like waffles, which is really, really nice. So I haven't tried that out yet, but I'm going to give that a go. And then if it goes well, I'll share it here as well. So yeah, if anyone has any particular stitches they frequently do with those, then I'd love to see them, because I'd like to incorporate lots of different stitches into this blanket I'm making with loads of different squares. So let's get started with the rib stitch. You often see rib stitches on sleeves and at the kind of bottom and top of jumpers, because they pull the fabric in a bit and they create a bit of a tighter part of the pattern. For example, on this sleeve you can see that the top section is a rib stitch. Now again, this is using the knit and the purl. We can see the raised bits here, those are where they've done a knit stitch, and these bits underneath the purl, and then it's reversed on the other side. 30 stitches on our needle, and in order to do a rib stitch, say if we were going to make each part of the rib 2 stitches wide, you would knit 2 and then pull the wool over onto the other side, down through the needle, and purl 2. So putting the needle up through the front of the stitch in the way that was demonstrated in my last video. Then you pull it back from the front again round to the back and knit for another 2. And then pull it back to the front again and purl for another 2. So you're basically just repeating this all the way to the end. So you knit 2, you purl 2. It's quite good to cast on an even number if you're going to do you're going to double up on ribbing and things like that. Obviously if you were just doing a single stitch rib, it wouldn't really matter, but it's nice to have an even number. So once you've done your 2 knits, 2 purls, 2 knits, 2 purls, 2 knits, 2 purls, along the needle you'll have areas where you have 2 little raised stitches and then 2 flat stitches, 2 raised stitches, 2 flat stitches, 2 raised stitches, 2 flat stitches, where you've done your knits and your purls. So now when you knit back into that pattern, if you're wanting to get the rib effect, then you make sure you purl into the raised stitches and you knit into the flat stitches. When you've done a few more rows of doing your ribbed pattern, you'll really start to see the pattern take shape, and obviously it's the reverse on the other side. Often in patterns with this rib stitch, when you're making garments, you knit them with slightly tighter needles because they're kind of a tighter part of the garment that kind of pulls in around your wrists or around your waist, etc. So that's a really good stitch to know. The really important thing is just knowing which bits to knit into and which bits to purl into, but it really becomes quite obvious once you've got the hang of it. And that's true for all of these different patterns that we're doing today. In a really similar way to the rib stitch, the moss seed stitch is just a case of alternating knits and purl stitches. I've cast on 30 stitches again there onto my needle. So this time I'm going to go for an entire row doing one knit, one purl, one knit, one purl the whole way along. The nice thing about this texture is it's the same on the front and back, so it's reversible. And I always think it's really soft. It's a really nice soft texture, and really nice for things like headbands or for scarves as well. And it doesn't curl up at the edges like stocking stitch or kind of bunch up like ribbing stitch does. So it's really nice that it always kind of stays flat. It's a nice effect, but it is quite fiddly to do, to kind of keep switching the wool over every single time. It is a bit of a faff and a fiddle. It's quite difficult to see there, but there's my first row of knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl. If I was to now turn the needle over and do the same stitch into each one, so if I was to knit into the knits and purl into the purls on the opposite side, then I would be creating the ribbed effect that we saw with the pattern we've just done, because you'd be knitting the same thing into the same stitches. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do the opposite of what I just did on the other sides. All of the knit stitches I'm going to do a purl into, and all of the purl stitches I'm going to do a knit into, thus reversing it. And so it creates that bumpy effect because within the pattern, those little purl stitches which are raised will then be followed by a knit. So each one will be raised and then flat, raised and then flat, and then the opposite will be true of the next stitch, so it kind of creates that nice bumpy effect. So with the double moss seed stitch, you're alternating every 2 rows instead of every row as you do with the moss seed stitch, and you're also alternating every 2 stitches, whereas with the moss seed stitch obviously you're alternating every other stitch. Here's a nice example of double moss seed stitch. So you can see, if you look very carefully, you've got the area where for 2 rows you've got your raised purls, and then for 2 rows you've got your flat knits, and it's exactly the same on the other side. So when you're knitting that, you're doing 2 purls, 2 knits, 2 purls, 2 knits for an entire row. Then for the next row, you continue to do the same, so you stay true to the stitch that's on your needle. So where it's a purl, you purl it, where it's a knit, you knit it. But for the 3rd row, you alternate it, and that's true of and then for the 4th one, you do the same as you've done on the 3rd. So every 2 rows, you're alternating those knits and purls, and it creates that really nice effect there. The other stitch that we talked about at the beginning was the basket weave stitch, which looks really nice. It's like a kind of woven basket, hence the name. So for this one, all you need to do is count. very well for the first few rows. But once you've started to kind of see that pattern emerging, it becomes really obvious where your knitting and your purling is meant to be. The best thing to do with this is to have an even number of stitches, and to be able to divide it into an even amount. I decided to divide it into 5s, so I had 6 different bits of within the pattern area. So I had 6 different bits within the pattern area. So I did 5 purls, 5 knits, 5 purls, 5 knits, 5 purls, 5 knits. So for 5 rows, I stayed true to the stitches on the needle. So I purled into the purls and I knitted into the knits every time I switched those needles over. And then after the 5th row, I alternated it. So I then started to knit into the purls and purl into the knits. And then again, I did that for 5 rows. And so you can very quickly start to see that kind of woven effect happening on your needles, because you're alternating those 5 rows of knits and purls. That makes a really nice effect, really nice for scarves, really nice for things like headbands, because it's just that bit more textured and interesting to look at. So we've gone over a few of the different stitches and textures that you can create using your knit and purl stitches that we went through last week. I think next week the video has to be casting off, because once you've created your little square of different patterns, obviously you need to know how to get those stitches safely off the needle without it all just coming unravelled. So next week I'm going to do a video on casting off, and I might incorporate some other stuff too. I might also talk about a project that I'm doing at the minute, a cardigan which is very nearly finished. I'm on the last sleeve, so that's quite exciting. So I might go through that and just show a little bit of that too. And I am going to do a Christmas present ideas video. That one's on the way. I've done a bit of planning for that, so that's probably going to be the week after. And yeah, thank you very much for watching. It's been really nice to make these videos and to challenge myself and kind of do different knits. If you find any other types of knitting pattern that you really like, if anyone tries out the waffle stitch, I think I've pinned that in my stocking stitch Pinterest board. So if you're on Pinterest, then there's a free pattern for the waffle stitch that you can find on my board, and I'm yet to try it out, but I'm going to very soon. And if anyone tries out any different types of stitches using the knit and purl, then let me know or send me a picture. That would be really nice. I'm really keen to just see how people are getting on. If people hadn't ever tried these different stitches before and they've now given them a go, I'd love to see what the effect is and how it turns out, if people are kind of making scarves or different blanket squares or anything with them. That would be brilliant. And thank you so much for watching. Please comment or like my video if you've enjoyed it, and send me a message if you want to know anything, and I will see you again next week.